Princess Vira, ruler of the Alfar Empire, stood in the grand hall of her palace, watching as yet another delegation of princes and suitors bowed before her. Each one was more polished than the last, their voices smooth, their gestures elegant, all offering gifts, titles, and promises of loyalty. Yet Vira's gaze remained cold and unwavering. For years, the most powerful leaders in the galaxy had tried and failed to win her favor, but she had rejected them all. It wasn't that she wasn't impressed by their appearances or their wealth. Each suitor was a reflection of the might and power of their respective empires. No, what she longed for was something deeper, something beyond the usual show of strength. She desired a mind to match her own, someone who could match her in intellect, in strategy, in vision. Vira's mind raced as the latest prince, Darien, stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his eyes burned with ambition, yet she saw through his polished exterior. He spoke of conquering new worlds together, of expanding their empires and sharing in the glory of it all. But it was all just talk. Vira knew that words could be empty, especially when spoken by those who only saw her as a prize to be won, a means to further their own agendas. She crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow, the silence in the room heavy with anticipation. "Princess Vira," Prince Darien said, his voice smooth as silk, "you are the jewel of the galaxy. Together, we could rule everything. I offer you my empire, my strength. What more could you need?" Vira couldn't help but roll her eyes inwardly. This was the same old story, repeated again and again. The same empty promises. She had seen it all before. No one, no matter how grand their offers, had truly impressed her. She longed for a challenge, someone who could keep up with her, someone who didn't just want to rule with her, but truly understood the weight of what it meant to rule at all. "Thank you, Prince Darien," Vira said, her voice calm yet firm, "but you misunderstand me. I seek not just an alliance, but a partner, a mind that challenges me, that pushes me beyond my limits. You may have strength, but I need more than that." The prince's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure, his pride refusing to show any sign of defeat. He bowed once more and left, his words still echoing in the hall. Vira watched him go, then turned to her advisors. They were all waiting for her decision, but she already knew what she would say. She had rejected countless suitors over the years, each one more powerful than the last, and none had come close to what she truly needed. As the door to the hall closed, Vira let out a long, tired sigh. What was the point of ruling an empire if the people she surrounded herself with were incapable of truly seeing her for who she was? She had no need for an alliance built on empty promises. She needed a mind that was as sharp, as cunning, and as driven as hers. But where could she find that? The galaxy seemed filled with men who were content to bask in their glory, but none who truly understood what it meant to lead. Little did she know, the person who would finally challenge her would not be from any royal bloodline, but from a faraway world, one she had never expected to encounter. The Galactic Council had called for a meeting to address the rising tensions between the Alfar Empire and Earth. Jackson Rook, a seasoned diplomat from Earth, stood nervously outside the council chamber, adjusting his suit. He wasn't like the other diplomats who came from wealthy backgrounds or powerful families. Jackson had grown up in the lower levels of Earth's megacities, surrounded by the constant hum of industry and the struggle for survival. He had learned early on how to navigate difficult situations, how to make deals and influence people with little more than his wits and a sharp tongue. But this was different. The Alfar princess, Vira, was known across the galaxy as an unyielding ruler, one who had turned away every suitor, every offer of alliance. Jackson had heard the rumors. No one had ever managed to win her favor, and many had tried. Yet here he was, standing on the edge of a diplomatic disaster, tasked with negotiating peace with one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. He knew the stakes were high. The fragile peace between Earth and the Alfar Empire was on the verge of collapse, and if this meeting failed, it could lead to war. Taking a deep breath, Jackson walked into the chamber. The Elfar representatives, with their calm and poised demeanor, turned to greet him. But it was Vira who captured his attention immediately. She sat at the head of the table, her presence undeniable. There was no doubt that she was the leader here, commanding respect without saying a word. Her eyes met his, sharp and calculating, as if she was already assessing him. "Jackson Rook," Vira said, her voice cool but not unkind. "I was not expecting a human diplomat. Tell me, what is it you think you can offer that all the others before you could not?" Jackson straightened, feeling the weight of her gaze. He wasn't like the other diplomats who had tried and failed before him. He wasn't here to offer grand promises or fancy titles. He was here to show that humanity, despite its flaws, had something valuable to offer, something that the Elfar might just find worth considering. "I'm not here to offer you riches, Princess," Jackson began, his voice steady. "I'm here to offer you something more important, a fresh perspective. We humans have faced struggles that have made us resilient, resourceful. We don't rely on the same old tactics as the others. We adapt, we learn, and we don't give up. I believe we can work together, find a way to ensure both our empires thrive, without the need for bloodshed." Vira studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Jackson couldn't tell whether she was amused or offended, but he wasn't about to back down. His words had weight, and he knew it. The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, Vira seemed to consider something more carefully than she had before. "You speak boldly, Jackson Rook," she said, her tone softer than he expected. "But words are easy. Show me that you are more than just a mouthpiece." Jackson nodded, his heart racing. This was his chance, his one opportunity to prove himself. The meeting had just begun, but already he knew the road ahead would be difficult. Vira wasn't going to make things easy, but for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could surprise her. Princess Vira's gaze never left Jackson Rook as he stood before her, unflinching. The room was tense, the weight of her expectation pressing down on him. Her challenge was simple but terrifying. If he wanted to prove his worth, he would have to match her in a duel of wits. Vira had built her empire through sharp intellect, strategy, and an unyielding will. She was used to being in control, to having the upper hand in every situation. And now, this human, this diplomat, was daring to stand before her and claim that he could match her. Jackson didn't flinch. He had been in tough spots before, navigating the streets of Earth's megacities where only the clever and the quick survived. This wasn't the same as negotiating with corporate giants or trying to avoid street gangs, but the rules of the game were still the same. Think fast, adapt, and always stay one step ahead. He knew Vira was intelligent, probably one of the sharpest minds in the galaxy, but he had something she didn't: the ability to see things from angles others missed. "Very well," Vira said, her voice cold, yet with an edge of curiosity. "You have your challenge, a series of tests designed to push your mind to its limits. Fail, and you leave here empty-handed. Succeed, and perhaps I'll reconsider your proposal." The room fell silent as the challenge began. The first test was simple, a series of complex riddles that demanded not only intelligence but creativity. Vira's voice echoed in the chamber as she presented each one, her tone calm and controlled. "What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening?" she asked, her eyes fixed on Jackson. Jackson paused for only a moment. He'd heard the riddle before, but this wasn't about answering quickly. It was about showing her he understood the depth of the question. "A human," he replied. "As a child, we crawl on all 4s. As an adult, we walk on 2. And in old age, we use a cane, walking with 3. Vira's eyes narrowed, impressed despite herself. The answer was correct, but she didn't show it. Instead, she moved to the next test. The next round was a tactical simulation, a complex scenario in which a fleet of ships was under attack by a powerful enemy force. Vira set the stage, her fingers dancing over the holographic controls as she created the simulation. It was a test of strategy and decision-making under pressure. Jackson studied the layout, his mind racing as he formulated a plan. He didn't have the experience that Vira did when it came to galactic warfare, but he understood the fundamentals. Misdirection, the element of surprise, and using what resources you had to their full potential. When the simulation ended, Vira raised an eyebrow. "Impressive," she said, though her voice was still guarded. "But tactics alone will not win a war. A leader must understand what drives people. You say humans are resourceful, but can you lead them to victory?" Jackson smiled, the challenge clear in his mind. "It's not just about tactics, Princess. It's about knowing when to take risks and when to trust your people. Leadership isn't just strategy. It's about inspiring others to believe in the impossible." Vira looked at him for a long moment, considering his words. She had heard many speak of leadership, but few had the confidence to challenge her so directly. This human, Jackson Rook, was different. He wasn't just following the rules, he was rewriting them. And that, more than anything, caught her attention. As Jackson Rook left the testing chamber, Vira's mind raced. She had never been so thoroughly challenged. Each of his answers, each of his moves, had caught her off guard. He wasn't just another diplomat. He was something else entirely. Most visitors to her empire had tried to impress her with their grandeur or power, but Jackson had done something different. He had made her think, forced her to reconsider everything she had assumed about humans. She had expected him to fail, as all the others before him had. But now she wasn't so sure. Outside the chamber, the mood had shifted. News had arrived that the Elfar Empire was on the brink of war with the Tizar, a ruthless alien race that had been encroaching on Elfar territory for months. Tensions were rising, and the Elfar fleet was already being mobilized. Vira's advisors were nervous, whispering about strategies and alliances, but Vira knew that this was not a situation that could be solved with brute force alone. The Tizar were strong, and the battle for dominance in this part of the galaxy was far from over. The peace talks with Earth seemed like a distant dream now, overshadowed by the threat of war. Jackson, however, wasn't fazed by the news. He had been in the heart of conflicts before, navigating delicate political landscapes where every decision could be a matter of life or death. When Vira called for a meeting with her council, Jackson stood quietly in the background, listening. The Elfar generals and advisors bickered about strategies, their voices rising in frustration. Everyone seemed to be in agreement that they would need to strike hard and fast to send a message to the Tizar. But Jackson saw things differently. After the meeting, he requested a private audience with Vira. She agreed, though she didn't expect much. He had proven himself as a thinker, but war was a different beast entirely. When they were alone, Jackson spoke without hesitation. "Princess, I don't think attacking first is the answer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If you strike, you risk pushing the Tizar into a corner where they'll have no choice but to retaliate with everything they have. You'll create a cycle of destruction, one that neither of us can afford." Vira's eyes locked onto him, her expression unreadable. "And what do you suggest we do, human?" she asked, her tone challenging but intrigued. Jackson leaned forward slightly. "We need to disrupt their strategy, not engage in direct combat. We infiltrate their command center, sow confusion in their ranks, make them question their own leadership, and make them doubt whether war is worth it. If we can cripple their morale, we'll force them to the negotiation table." Vira stared at him, considering his words. He wasn't offering the usual solutions, the usual military tactics. He was offering something more subtle, more strategic. It wasn't the path she would have chosen, but something about his proposal resonated with her. For the first time, she felt that maybe Jackson's approach could work. He had a point. War could be avoided, but only if they were willing to take risks and think beyond the obvious. "Interesting," Vira said after a long pause. "You're suggesting a risk, but if it works, it could change everything." Jackson nodded. Sometimes, the greatest victories don't come from fighting harder. They come from thinking smarter. Vira looked at him, her respect for him growing. Maybe, just maybe, Jackson Rook was the kind of partner she had been searching for all along. Someone who didn't just play by the rules, but was ready to rewrite them. The tension between the Alfar Empire and the Tsar was reaching a boiling point, and Princess Vira knew that time was running out. The council chambers had been filled with the same arguments for days: strategies of war, alliances, and defenses. The military leaders were determined to strike first, to show the Tsar that Alfar was not a force to be trifled with. But Jackson Rook's words echoed in her mind, urging her to think differently. He had already proven himself to be a strategic thinker, someone who could see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Jackson had spent the last few days observing the Tsar's movements, piecing together intelligence, and talking with the Alfar generals in a way that no one else had. He wasn't part of their world, yet he understood something they didn't: the value of unpredictability. Vira had been skeptical at first, but as she watched him work, she realized how much he had to offer. "Princess, you've been looking at this from the wrong angle," Jackson said one evening, after another heated council meeting. "The Tsar are predictable. They rely on force, on intimidation, but they're not invincible. What they don't expect is for us to strike from within." Vira sat back, her brow furrowing. "Explain." Jackson's eyes sparkled with determination. "We have the intelligence. We know their weaknesses. But more than that, we know how to undermine their confidence. If we infiltrate their leadership, create chaos within their ranks, we can force them into a situation where they'll have no choice but to negotiate. We won't fight them head-on. We'll break them down from the inside." Vira's mind raced. Jackson's plan wasn't about brute force. It was about subversion. It was a gamble, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Vira had always been taught that strength was the only way to win, but Jackson had shown her another path. A path that relied not on weapons, but on intelligence, strategy, and the power of perception. "If we do this," Vira said slowly, "we risk everything. If they catch wind of our plan, it could destroy us." Jackson smiled, a glimmer of confidence in his eyes. "If we do nothing, we lose anyway. We have nothing to lose but the war." Vira studied him carefully. She had seen many diplomats, many warriors, but there was something different about Jackson. He wasn't just trying to survive the situation. He was trying to win, and he was willing to take risks to do it. That kind of thinking was rare, even among the most brilliant minds of the galaxy. "I'll take your plan to the council," Vira said, her voice steady. "But if this goes wrong, it will be on both of us." Jackson didn't flinch. "Then we'll make sure it doesn't go wrong." The next few days were filled with intense preparation. Vira and Jackson worked closely together, coordinating the details of the infiltration. It was a dangerous mission, one that would test both their leadership and their ability to work together under pressure. But for the first time, Vira felt a spark of hope. She wasn't facing this challenge alone anymore. Jackson had proven himself worthy of her trust, and together, they might just pull off the impossible. The stakes were high, but the reward, peace without bloodshed, was worth every risk. The night before the operation, Vira stood alone on the balcony of her palace, staring out into the vast expanse of space. The stars seemed so distant, so cold, and yet the weight of the mission pressed down on her shoulders. She had spent her entire life leading an empire with strength and fear, but now she was embarking on something far riskier, using strategy and subtlety to outmaneuver an enemy. If Jackson's plan failed, the consequences would be devastating. The Tsar would retaliate with fury, and the Alfar Empire could be shattered. A voice behind her broke the silence. "You're thinking about it too much." Vira turned to find Jackson standing at the door, his usual calm demeanor masking his own nerves. He had been working alongside her, helping to orchestrate the intricate details of the mission. They had spent hours going over every angle, every possible outcome, and Vira couldn't deny the trust she had begun to place in him. Despite his humanity, despite everything she had known about the galaxy's complex politics, Jackson had proven to be an unexpected ally. "I'm not worried about failure," Vira replied, her voice low. "I'm worried about the cost. The Tizar don't take betrayal lightly. If they catch even a hint of what we're planning, they'll strike first. We'll be starting a war we can't finish." Jackson stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Then we make sure they don't catch on. We move fast. We move smart. We do what they never expect." Vira glanced at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just talking about a military operation. He was talking about the kind of thinking that had gotten humanity through some of the toughest battles in history. Jackson was right. This wasn't about brute force or overwhelming firepower. This was about disrupting the Tizar system, making them question their own strength, sowing discord among their ranks. If they could do that, they could force the Tizar into a corner, one where they would be forced to negotiate on Elthar's terms. "We've gone over this plan 1,000 times," Vira said, trying to steady her thoughts. "But there are always variables, things we can't control. I'm not sure I'm ready for what could happen." Jackson's eyes softened for a moment. "None of us are. But sometimes we just have to make a choice and go with it. It's not about being sure. It's about believing we can make it work. We've come this far together, Vira. We can finish this." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. There was a quiet strength in him, a confidence that came from more than just intellect. It came from his belief in their shared purpose. For the first time, Vira felt like she wasn't just the ruler of an empire, but part of something larger, something worth fighting for. She had led armies, commanded fleets. But this was different. Jackson was showing her that leadership wasn't just about dominance. It was about trust, about relying on others when the stakes were highest. "I hope you're right," she said, finally allowing herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Jackson nodded. "We'll make them see it, together." With a final glance at the starry sky, Vira turned toward the door. It was time to move. The operation was set in motion. There was no turning back now. As she and Jackson made their way to the command center, Vira's heart was steady. She had faced countless enemies and challenges in her life. But this was the beginning of something that could change everything. Victory wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time, Vira felt a spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could outthink their enemies and win without firing a single shot. The mission began at dawn, as the first light of the twin suns pierced the horizon of Vira's homeworld. The air was thick with anticipation, every corner of the palace buzzing with the quiet hum of preparations. Vira stood in the command center, her eyes scanning the data streams that flowed in front of her. The Elfar fleet was ready, poised to make the first move in the mission to infiltrate the Tizar. She felt the weight of the operation pressing down on her. One wrong step, one mistake, and everything could unravel. Jackson stood beside her, his usual calm demeanor now tempered by a hint of excitement. He wasn't part of the Elfar military, but in the last few days, he had worked tirelessly alongside the generals, coordinating the technical aspects of the mission. His ability to think quickly and adapt was already proving invaluable. Together, they had crafted a plan that relied not on brute force, but on stealth and precision. They would use the Tizar's own weaknesses against them, striking in a way they never expected. "Are we ready?" Vira asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Almost," Jackson replied. "The first phase is underway. We have teams positioned near their borders, monitoring their communications. Once we get the signal, we move in." Vira nodded, her mind racing. She had led her people through countless battles. But this felt different. She wasn't commanding an army this time. She was relying on the element of surprise, using intelligence and timing as her weapons. It was a high-stakes game, one that required every ounce of focus and skill she had. Hours passed, each one dragging by in excruciating silence. The tension in the command center was palpable as Vira and Jackson watched the data unfold on the screens. The first wave of distractions had gone off without a hitch. The Tizar were beginning to react, deploying forces to investigate the false signals they had been fed. But Vira knew the hardest part was yet to come. "We're in position," Jackson said, his voice low. "The next step is up to you, Princess." Vira took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tapping on the edge of the console. The infiltration teams were already moving, slipping past Tizar defenses with practiced precision. The plan was working so far, but the true test would come when they reached the heart of the Tizar command structure. There they would plant the seeds of doubt, infiltrating their highest leaders and feeding them false information, enough to destabilize their command. If it worked, the Tizar would fall into disarray, their leadership fighting among themselves. But if they failed, Vira pushed the thought aside, focusing on the moment at hand. She could feel the eyes of the generals on her, waiting for her to give the order. The mission was in her hands now. "Prepare for Phase 2, she said, her voice steady and resolute. As the final pieces fell into place, Jackson gave her a quick nod. They had made it this far. Now all they had to do was stay one step ahead. The tension between the Elfar and the Tizar had reached a breaking point, and Vira knew that this moment, this operation, would either secure peace or lead to war. She wasn't ready to let everything she had worked for slip away, not without a fight. The pieces were set. It was time to see if they had the courage to finish what they had started. The minutes felt like hours as Vira and Jackson watched the unfolding events with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The data streams continued to flow, showing every move the Tizar made in response to their carefully crafted distractions. Phase 1 of the operation had gone smoothly, too smoothly. Vira's heart pounded in her chest as she focused on the next stage, the one that could either solidify their victory or tear everything apart. "All units in position," Jackson said, his voice tight but controlled. "Phase 2 is a go." Vira gave a single nod, signaling the commanders to proceed. The infiltration teams had already begun their silent approach into the heart of the Tizar's command center. They would breach the highest levels of the Tizar's power structure, planting misinformation that could cause confusion and mistrust among their leaders. It was a dangerous game, but Vira had come to trust Jackson's strategy. It was the only chance they had to prevent a full-scale war. The first wave of information had already been transmitted, a series of fake signals designed to make the Tizar question their military's readiness and leadership. The results were immediate. Tizar commanders began to argue amongst themselves, with their forces pulling back in disarray, confused by the sudden changes in their tactical plans. But Vira knew it was just the beginning. The real challenge was pushing their advantage without tipping their hand. "This is the critical point," Vira murmured, glancing over at Jackson. "If they catch wind of what we're doing, they'll retaliate, and it won't be pretty." "I know," Jackson replied, his eyes fixed on the data. "But if we can make them question their authority, if we can get them to panic, we might be able to force them into a ceasefire. At the very least, it'll buy us time." Vira took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the console. The screen in front of her showed the growing chaos within the Tizar ranks. The plan was working. They were destabilizing their enemy without a single shot being fired. The Tizar, known for their ruthlessness and discipline, were now showing signs of fracture. Their arrogance had been their greatest strength, but it was also their greatest weakness. Vira had always understood that true power wasn't just in brute force. It was in controlling perception, in making others doubt their own certainty. But there was no time to relax. The Tizar were quick to adapt, and Vira knew they wouldn't be disoriented for long. They were a fierce enemy, and their pride would drive them to retaliate in ways they hadn't yet anticipated. The mission had gone well so far, but it wasn't over yet. Vira couldn't afford to lose her focus now. "We have to keep pushing," she said, her voice low but firm. "Stay ahead of them. We can't let them regain control." Jackson nodded, his eyes scanning the live feed. "We will." We've got them on the ropes, but we need to make it count. Just a little longer. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, but slowly the Tsar began to fracture. Their once unified command structure was splintering as each leader scrambled to assert their dominance. Vira knew they were close, but as the chaos within the Tsar's ranks continued to build, a single thought lingered in the back of her mind. Would it be enough? Would their gambit truly bring the Tsar to their knees, or was this just the beginning of a much larger conflict? There was no way to know for sure, but Vira wasn't the kind to back down, and neither was Jackson. Together, they had brought the Tsar to the brink. Now, all they could do was wait and hope that their daring plan had worked. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly as Vira and Jackson watched the chaos within the Tsar ranks unfold. The operation had been delicate, every move calculated to the finest detail. But now the tension was unbearable. The Tsar were on the verge of collapse, their leaders bickering and fighting for control, unsure of how to handle the sudden disorder. Vira stood at the center of the command room, her gaze fixed on the swirling data, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the bigger picture. The mission was far from over. Phase 3 is live, Jackson said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Anticipation, perhaps. He had trusted this plan from the beginning, and now they were seeing the fruits of their labor. The Tsar, once so confident and imposing, were unraveling. It was a delicate balance, but it was working. Vira didn't respond immediately. She was deep in thought, her fingers drumming lightly on the console in front of her. The infiltration teams had delivered their final blow. The misinformation had spread through the highest ranks of the Tsar, sowing distrust, fear, and confusion. It was a psychological war, one that was difficult to see from the outside, but it was having the desired effect. The Tsar were beginning to question everything: their military readiness, their leadership, their place in the galaxy. They were stumbling, faltering in ways that Vira had never expected. But even as the Tsar crumbled, Vira couldn't help but wonder, how long could this last? The Tsar were fierce, and their pride was something not easily broken. There was still the risk of retaliation, of an all-out assault to regain their lost position. Vira felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on her. She had made a choice, a risky one, and it was paying off. But the true test would come in the hours that followed. "We need to be ready," she said, her voice firm. "If they regroup, we'll need to have a backup plan in place." Jackson nodded. "They won't get the chance. Not if we keep them off balance. This is the moment we've been waiting for." Vira's fingers moved over the console, initiating the next step in the operation. She had anticipated this, anticipated the possibility of the Tsar managing to pull themselves back together. It was why they had made sure their psychological strike had been so thorough. They had built a scenario in which no matter how the Tsar tried to recover, they would still be left questioning their next move. It was like watching a predator chase its prey, except now the prey was the one in control. The tension in the room mounted as Vira and Jackson watched the final data streams, the last phase of the plan set into motion. The Tsar were slow to react, their military scrambling as their leadership crumbled. Vira's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. She wasn't just the princess of an empire now. She was the leader of a people on the brink of peace. And if Jackson's plan succeeded, if they could keep the Tsar distracted just a little longer, they might secure a future without war. After what felt like an eternity, a final message blinked on Vira's screen. The Tsar were officially requesting a ceasefire. A war had been avoided. Vira let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. For the first time in a long while, the weight of the galaxy didn't feel quite so heavy. She turned to Jackson, who stood with a quiet smile. "We did it," she said softly. Jackson's eyes met hers, filled with quiet pride. "We did." And for the first time, Vira knew that peace wasn't just possible, it was within their reach. The news of the ceasefire spread like wildfire across the Elfar Empire. Vira stood in the palace's grand hall, her heart heavy with the knowledge of how close they had come to the brink of war. The Tsar, once a powerful and fearsome force, had finally acknowledged their defeat, if only temporarily. The peace talks would begin soon, but the real work was just beginning. Vira couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The gamble she and Jackson had taken had worked, but it had only been the first step. A fragile peace was now in their grasp, and it was up to her, and Jackson by her side, to make sure it didn't slip away. "We've done what we had to do," Jackson said, his voice calm as always, but there was a glimmer of relief in his eyes. "Now we have to make sure we handle the aftermath carefully. One wrong move, and it could all collapse." Vira turned to him, her gaze steady. She had come to rely on his counsel more than anyone else in her court. Jackson wasn't just a strategist. He was a realist, and that had made all the difference. As a leader, Vira had always been prepared for conflict, but the art of peace was something far more delicate. They had won, but now they had to ensure the Tsar saw the advantage in diplomacy, not in retribution. "We'll handle it," Vira said, the weight of her responsibility grounding her. "I've already sent word to the Tsar leaders. The peace talks are scheduled for tomorrow." Jackson nodded. "I trust you'll be ready. This isn't just about ending the war. It's about making sure the Tsar understand that their way of ruling can't be sustained. If we're too lenient, they'll think they've won." Vira was quiet for a moment, contemplating his words. She had always been taught that strength was the ultimate measure of power. But now she understood that true power came from influence and the ability to steer others toward mutual benefit. The Tsar were powerful, but they were also proud. And pride, she had learned, could be both a strength and a weakness. "I've been thinking," Vira began, her voice soft but determined. "Maybe this war isn't just about territory or military might. Maybe it's about changing how both our empires see each other." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "How do you mean?" "Maybe we need to change the narrative," she said. "We don't need to make the Tsar weaker. We need to make them understand that the strength we share, our intelligence, our ability to adapt, is what will ensure peace. It's not a fight for dominance. It's a fight for survival." Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly impressed by the depth of her thinking. "You're suggesting a new approach, a partnership." Vira nodded. "A partnership, something the galaxy has never seen before." As the final pieces of the peace talks fell into place, Vira and Jackson knew the stakes were high. The future of both empires lay in the hands of the negotiators. The Tsar had already felt the sting of their own vulnerabilities, and the Elfar had proven they were not just warriors, but thinkers. As the day of peace approached, Vira stood beside Jackson, ready to face whatever challenges came next. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new era, and together, they would shape it.